What is piety and consent? Piety is trying to build a protected life for everyone. You will protect your rights, your law, your dignity, and so on. And within this protection, the most fundamental element to ensure this protection is to transparently establish the concept of accountability. For example, before the Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina, he held a meeting with the women of Medina. He invited them, and was there a contract there attended only by women? It was verbal. He asked, if I come to Medina, will you support me? Only women. Even the existence of disagreement, of different opinions, is a mercy. Why? Because when different perspectives are brought together around a single focus, they strengthen and empower it.
Istanbul. Greetings to everyone from the school. Dear viewers, today we will talk about the concept of consent and the Society of Consent in the context of verse 109 of Surah at-Tawbah. Our guest is Professor Dr. Şaban Ali Düzgün. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Today, we want to discuss the concept of consent together with the concept of Ridwan. You also referred to it as the Society of Consent for this topic, for today's discussion. So, we will talk about this in the context of verse 109 of Surah at-Tawbah. So, you actually start by defining topics with the etymology of the words. How do you interpret the concept of consent, Rida? How would you define it in the context of its relationship with Ridwan? What would you say?
Yes, in the verse 109 of Surah at-Tawbah that we mentioned, a certain social structure is being proposed there. It is said to be based on two foundations. Just to recall, the verse goes like this, or is he who laid the foundation of his building on piety from Allah and his good pleasure, Ridwan, better. And it continues from there. In other words, are those who build their societies on piety and divine approval the same as those who build on the edge of a cliff? Those who build on the edge of a cliff will tumble down along with the society they have built, falling into the abyss, it says. That's what the verse says. Here, I wanted to highlight a particular word. That word is Ridwan, which appears there. Ridwan comes from the same root as Rida, contentment/approval. Ridwan and Rida. These are familiar terms in our culture. I just want to remind friends, so it might spark a couple of associations. There is an allegiance in history known as the Pledge of Ridwan. It was the pledge that took place before the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. It was a pledge that took place 2 years before the conquest of Mecca. A rumor spreads that Hazrat Osman has been killed in Mecca, and the Prophet takes a pledge from the people who set out with him for Umrah, asking them to promise that, if necessary, they will fight with their lives and wealth to avenge such an insult. He takes this pledge from the companions, and they all say, O Messenger of Allah, whatever you say, that's what we'll do. This is also mentioned in the Quran, and it says that God was pleased with those who gave this pledge, those who stood firm in the most difficult and trying times. This is known as the Pledge of Ridwan. Secondly, there is a paradise known as Ridwan Paradise. It doesn't describe Ridwan Paradise as a specific place or location, but rather as a state above all other paradises where God's pleasure is attained. Ridwan Paradise and Ridwan al-Akbar. It says that the greatest of all paradises is to attain God's pleasure. Ridwan Paradise is also referred to in this way in the Quran. If you look at what is inside Ridwan, inside pleasure, for example, if we say to someone, why did you do such a thing without getting my approval? Why are we objecting? It means you didn't take my will into account. So, within pleasure, there is one of the most fundamental elements that make a person human, and that is willpower. That's why, If we look very carefully at the verse, it says in Surah Yusuf, verse 76, Allah raises the ranks of those who will, meaning those who use their willpower many times over. Therefore, it shows that a social structure where willpower is exercised, where other wills are not blocked or hindered, and where other wills are also taken into account, forms the foundation for collective development, growth, empowerment, and progress. In other words, if you are going to build a society and you want its foundation to be very solid, the act of considering all wills is called Ridvan. It is Rida, it is consent, and when you have that, your foundation is solid. In the Quran, in this verse, it is asked, can those who build their societies on piety and consent ever be the same as those who build on the edge of a cliff? This means, if you try to align everyone and make them a part of society through a top-down approach, by imposing authority without considering people's consent and will, that's what we call a herd society. There are different types of societies. If people are not participating with their own will, then it's a herd society.
It becomes a society doomed to collapse.
And the second part of the verse says it's as if that society is built on the edge of a cliff. It could fall down at any moment because you didn't take their will into account. People might say, you didn't consider my will, and they could rise up, they could rebel. Therefore, I don't want to focus on that first fundamental principle, Taqwa, today. If we want to put it very briefly, what are Taqwa and consent? Taqwa is trying to build a protected life for everyone. You will protect your rights, your law, your dignity, and so on. And within this protection, the most fundamental element to ensure this protection is to transparently establish the concept of accountability. You will set up a system where everyone is held accountable. The rulers, the ruled, the workers, the employers. From the very top to the very bottom, everyone will be accountable. It will be transparent so that afterwards, this protected way of life can emerge. In other words, because I will be held accountable, I will be careful, and because I am careful, I will protect myself and no one else's rights or justice will be lost. This is piety. Even the person at the very top, the ruler or the king, will take into account the supervision and questioning of the divine authority above him. Just imagine you're telling someone who says, I'm not accountable to anyone, that piety means accountability, and that he is not exempt from this either. In that social structure, piety is an element that provides a kind of foundational balance. If we look at it in the context of political theories, the word consent is actually a modern term. In other words, it's a term from the last 4 centuries. There was no such thing as consent in the Middle Ages. So what was there in the Middle Ages? There's the will of kings. And when the king exercises his will, since the king is considered God's shadow on earth, a kind of representative, he absolutely does not recognize any other will that would oppose his own. So there is no will at all. Never. So what is there? There is reason. But let's be careful here. The reason I'm talking about is not the same as the one used during the Enlightenment or in the modern era, not the reason that became the slogan of the Enlightenment, as Kant said. Sapir ode, meaning have the courage to use your own understanding. He says, use your own individual reason. However, in the pre-modern era, in the Middle Ages, there is a founding reason. That is, the founding reason could be the reason of a sect. It could be the reason of a church. The founding reason could be the reason of the religious scholars. There is an established order, and you are expected to conform to that order. I think the same way myself. My will is like that too, in the Middle Ages. You don't have that kind of chance. Therefore, the word consent is a modern word. And the fact that, even before political theories were formed, the word consent is taken in the Quran as one of the 2 main elements that establish a society is, in my opinion, very groundbreaking. I mean, for example, The fact that the Prophet, in a way unprecedented in history, as soon as he arrived in Medina, gathered the founding elements of Medina, the local people, Jews, polytheists, Christians, Muslims, all of them, and made a social contract, that is consent. Look, this is about forming a society through a mutual contract, ensuring mutual pluralism, and having everyone declare their rights and responsibilities under constitutional protection. These are your rights, and these are your responsibilities to protect those rights. We can all live together in Medina. But for this right to be realized, the responsibility to repel any attack on Medina falls on all of us.
Yes.
If someone neglects this responsibility, that's exactly why the Banu Qurayza and Banu Qaynuqa Jews were later exiled. They wanted to exercise their rights, but when it came to responsibility, they were nowhere to be found. During the Battle of the Trench, the Jews who supported the polytheists coming from Mecca and informed them about the routes into Medina were later exiled to Syria. Why? Because we made an agreement. Everyone became a party to that agreement of their own free will. We said that we would exercise all our rights here, our citizenship rights. Our Prophet called everyone an Ummah. Jews were part of the Ummah, Christians were part of the Ummah, polytheists were part of the Ummah, and so were Muslims. What does Ummah mean there? Citizen. So, what is our responsibility to exercise this right? This is the homeland of all of us. We will all stand against any attack that comes from outside. But what did you do? You went and collaborated with the enemy. In that case, you acted against this agreement. What is the punishment for acting against this? Exile. Look, when you make an agreement, your foundation becomes strong, and when you move on to a legal practice, there is no problem. Because the Prophet asked this to the Jews. If someone who is a party to an agreement made according to your terms betrays it, if it's a kind of treason against the homeland, what punishment does your law prescribe for this? Look, he doesn't give the verdict himself, he asks them. Their rabbis, the ones we call their religious leaders, gather together. They are the ones who make the decision. The punishment for this is death, exile, and so on. So, in this context, the concept of consent in the modern era means taking individual will into account. Because everyone becomes a part of society. So, take your own will into account. An example of this is the Charter of Medina by the Prophet Muhammad. We call it the Charter of Medina. But the reason we call it a charter is because there is an actual document. If we were to give it a more descriptive name, I would prefer to call it a social contract, because it includes all the individuals and tribes of the society. I want to emphasize the plurality, the diverse structure there. I mean, for example, if you said that even the polytheists participated in the Battle of Badr, that the polytheists from Medina joined, and even Christians took part, people might be surprised. How is that possible? Wasn't the Battle of Medina a war fought by Muslims? Yes, but all the natives of Medina were involved in that war to defend their homeland. Why? Because you brought everyone together with a contract. The Prophet's establishment of such a confederate system, bringing together tribes that used to fight each other, consulting them, obtaining their consent, and making them parties to a social contract, is a first in history. So, weren't there laws before, like the laws of UNM? There is, yes. But how is what was done here different? You obtain people's consent. It's not imposed from above by a founding authority. It's based on consent. Therefore, seeing an example of a theory developed in the modern era reflected in the Medina Charter is truly impressive. So, instead of a system imposed by what you call a founding authority, it's something that people choose on their own, enjoying with their consent, and this also brings responsibility along with it. In one of the previous episodes, we talked about a covenant, a contract, the Bezamai Elist, that we made with God. The two, it's clear that we joined this agreement by giving our consent, and as a result, we took on a responsibility. Actually, I drew a bit of a parallel with that, Professor. Again, there's a contract, and because we joined this contract of our own free will, we end up taking on a responsibility. Absolutely, that's a very relevant, it's a correct connection. What's important here is that the consent from different groups, will actually enhance the quality of the whole, or rather, the parts will improve the quality of the whole, and that we will support each other there. For example, in the Quran, it says to the people of the book, "Come to a common word between us and you," inviting us to meet on common ground. The root of the word tiliv in that invitation means to rise together. The word Allah means to elevate, to grow. It's about escaping from the current conditions, freeing ourselves from the circumstances that dominate us, getting rid of risks, and coming out of crisis. In all these matters, it says, come together. Who is being invited together? The people of the book. Who are the people of the book? Jews and Christians. So when you invite others, their cooperation elevates you. Yes, that is, it's not about alienation or exclusion. That's why in the Quran, the concept of disagreement. This is a saying of the Prophet. The disagreement among my community is a mercy. Disagreement, caliph. In other words, it comes from the same root as caliph, the one God created as his representative on earth. In Turkish, the word mudlif, meaning diversity, also comes from the same root. Disagreement, even the existence of different opinions, is a mercy. Why? Because when different perspectives are brought together around a common focus, they strengthen and empower it. Well, when we look at today, teacher, that's a beautiful message. But on the other hand, when we look at modern times, we actually say that compared to previous eras, we act with more free will and behave according to our own consent. But is it really like that? Is it possible to say that there is no founding mind right now, that we are completely free and that we act accordingly? Not entirely. But if you look at the Middle Ages, the times of feudal structures, kingdoms, those eras, you will see without a doubt that humanity has progressed. Today, there is a concept of civil society. We talk about civility. In the past, you couldn't talk about such a thing. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's China, India, the Middle East, or the West. What I'm saying is a very general statement. As I said, will and consent are words produced by the modern era. In other words, you can only talk about the concept of social contracts with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. About the social contract. But what I'm saying is that the Prophet Muhammad's Constitution of Medina is the first example of a social contract. Yes, it's a definition of rights and responsibilities. It took centuries for you to reach your Magna Carta in 1215. So, it's significant that something like this was done long before the Magna Carta, which is considered the first written definition of rights and law. Behind that, I see the power of a divine will that wants different wills to be taken into account. In a time when even the right to life and many other rights were not recognized and slavery existed, granting such freedom and will truly represents a major revolution and signifies a great social contract. Absolutely, allegiance. Even what you call allegiance, for example, is actually obtaining consent. So, before the Prophet migrated from Mecca to Medina, he held a meeting with the women of Medina. He invited them, and was there a contract there attended only by women? It was verbal. He asked, if I come to Medina, will you support me? Only women. This is the allegiance or pledge of these women. Look, it's about obtaining their consent. It's almost like a joke here. The fact that the Prophet specifically invited only women and took such an oath of allegiance from them, a declaration of consent, is an incredible example. It's truly remarkable. But our history has gotten stuck on this point, and that's also quite tragicomic. People debate whether the Prophet, when taking the pledge from women, shipped their hands, held their hands, or just had them hold his robe or cloak. We still get hung up on these kinds of details. Unfortunately, this debate exists in our culture, but in reality, there's a much deeper meaning there. It's trying to open the doors of that meaning to you. Yes, by the way, let's make sure we've mentioned this as well. We keep getting stuck on the details. More importantly, we are not stuck anymore. So, thank God. We are trying to overcome them, and if you ask me, the accumulation of theology, religious accumulation in the Great Turkey, a meaning opened by these discussions. A larger universe of meaning is slowly coming into existence. It's starting to reach that point. I think those parts we used to argue about are now somewhat behind us. I hope I'm not mistaken. Hopefully, Professor. So, let's say we've offered a perspective here as well. Thank you very much for your valuable insights. Dear viewers, today we talked about the concept of Rida in the context of verse 109 of Surah at-Tawbah. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.